This show doesn't shy away from asking tough, sometimes personal questions. So, if you're out living your life, either on a walk or on the subway or driving on a long, empty stretch of road, where do you go when you gotta go? The US has 8 public toilets per 100,000 people, a number comparable with the rate in Botswana, and far behind Iceland's world-leading 56 public toilets per 100,000. So why is it so hard to find a public toilet in the US? It's a question with a complicated answer and that has a long history. And surprisingly, it relates to a ton of different issues, including public health, social services, and just about every form of discrimination you could think of. Yeah, you heard me. All of that just for a toilet. Public toilets were a fact of life in the US and elsewhere for centuries, at least as far back as the Roman Empire. But they were pretty public, without any walls or barriers between them. The expectation for privacy while going to the bathroom in a public space emerged in the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution and houses with modern plumbing. And later on in the 19th century and into the early decades of the 20th century, sanitation became a greater priority. Temple University history professor Bryant Simon, who has studied and is writing an upcoming book on the history of toilets, told us more about how toilets used to be a big deal.
City officials get on their soapboxes and brag about how much they spend on public bathrooms. They brag about the touch points in these bathrooms. They brag about the brass fittings. They brag about the marble countertops. They brag about the floors. They're proud of their accomplishment.
And bathrooms quickly became points where people were segregated. Bathrooms were split up by gender, as they still frequently are. But the splits can be broader than that and led to discrimination against many different groups. For example, public toilets started closing as early as the 1930s, with the LGBTQ community as a target.
Beginning in the 1930s and 1940s, that early, public officials begin to complain about perversion. They begin to complain about same-sex sex in bathrooms, as there's fears about gay sex in bathrooms, there's fear about people drinking in bathrooms. It's not a very popular city sort of thing to build anymore.
And in the first half of the 20th century, bathrooms often were segregated by race, with Black Americans or Latinos in the Southwest having their own separate facilities.
The bathroom sort of operates as a kind of hardware of inequality. Essentially, you needed a public bathroom or a bathroom of some sort in order to be out and in public.
Racial segregation in toilets may sound like a distant thing or a footnote, but that legacy extends into our time. In 2018, 2 Black men were blocked from using the restroom at a Starbucks location in Philadelphia's Center City. The incident prompted Starbucks to take on a role as America's de facto public toilets, as it changed its policy to allow people to use the restrooms at its more than 15,000 US locations without buying anything. While money can be a barrier to private toilets in stores, historically, it's limited access to public standalone toilets too. By the 1960s and 70s, public toilets requiring small payments sprung up, but those ended up closing after concerns about gender discrimination. So now, if you don't have a home of your own, it can put access to a restroom pretty far away.
Most of us are used to having our own bathroom. Where I lived when I was unhoused, the nearest bathroom was a 1-mile walk away. Imagine walking a mile to the bathroom. You know, most of us can't fathom walking 50 feet to our bathroom, let alone a mile.
Raven Drake works with unhoused people in Portland as a part of the local newspaper Street Roots. She's an advocate for bathroom access as a central part of addressing homelessness.
We ran a survey around bathrooms, around the importance of bathrooms and access to clean water with the Joint Office of Homeless Services. And a resounding amount of people answered that they had no access to public restrooms. And so we took forth on this initiative of placing out throughout the city 172 porta potties.
Underinvestment has been a major concern too. If public toilets aren't funded or attended, they can fall into disrepair. They can potentially become unsafe or unhygienic. Starbucks announced in July that it would close 16 stores due to safety concerns. CEO Howard Schultz said in June that the coffee giant may restrict its currently public restrooms to customers only as a part of its broader push for store safety. So, if Starbucks makes this decision to no longer serve as America's public restroom, where will we be able to go? Even if you're not homeless, bathroom access advocates like American Restroom Association President Stephen Seufer point out this is an issue
for everyone, for people with shy bladder, for people with incontinence, for people with bladder issues of different sorts, people who, had health issues, and families with children who, often struggle to find a place.
Stephen is calling on government officials to step up here, but it may have to be local officials taking the lead.
There are going to be fewer and fewer options, for people to be able to relieve themselves. And that becomes a public health issue as well.
If there are no bathrooms available, the consequences can be deadly for communities. In 2017, at least 16 people died and hundreds more got sick in San Diego in an outbreak of hepatitis A. The disease spread in large part due to contact with fecal matter and public defecation. The city acknowledged that a lack of public restrooms, especially for unhoused people, was part of the issue and helped contain the outbreak by installing public toilets and hand washing stations. But even then, a lack of funding or upkeep can quickly lead to toilets disappearing. A report earlier this year from researchers at San Diego State University found many of the toilets closed after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that nearly half of the county's census tracts, home to 40% of the population, had no public restrooms. Other cities are moving ahead with plans to install new public toilet facilities, including Portland, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. But there's still a shortage of public toilets in the U.S., and it's pretty dire. In 2011, a United Nations independent expert studied water and sanitation rights on a mission to the U.S. Her report found an instance in Sacramento where public restroom closures and enforcement of public urination and defecation laws led to a homeless person traveling miles to dump a whole community's human waste. Katarina de Albuquerque is the Chief Executive Officer of Sanitation and Water for All, a UN-hosted partnership working toward universal water, sanitation, and hygiene. Katarina, thank you so much for joining us. How does the U.S.'s shortage of public restrooms compare to the rest of the world?
The U.S. doesn't look that well. So, for example, we have 56 toilets per 100,000 people in Iceland. So this is the best country in the world, followed by Switzerland and then New Zealand. And the U.S. has 8. So the top has 56, U.S. has 8 toilets per 1,000 inhabitants, which puts the U.S. at the level of Botswana in Africa. So it's not right, meaning there is a long way to go, and there is a lot that the U.S. can and should be doing in order to improve access to public toilets.
You had a mission to come to the U.S. and examine water and sanitation. I'm curious to know, what was your mission to the U.S. like?
It was hard for me to see the situation of lack of public restrooms. In particular, the shutting down of public restrooms as a means to dissuade homeless people from living in certain cities, in certain towns. We are talking about human rights, right? Fundamental human rights. I was saddened by the number of people without access to public toilets and about how this impacted their lives, but also their dignity.
One of the most recognizable names when it comes to this particular issue is Starbucks. Their consideration of closing its public restrooms has garnered a lot of attention. But if Starbucks decides it won't be America's public restroom, where should that responsibility fall?
Because what Starbucks is doing is, of course, it's a good practice. And also business the business community has responsibilities when it comes to human rights. But the obligation, the legal obligation of making this happen, well, it's on the states. I would say it's on the government. Human rights obligations are binding on states, on governments, on public entities. And of course, I was saying before, the private sector can play a role. The main obligation is very clear. The law is very clear. The legal obligation is on the government.
Catarina de Albuquerque is the Chief Executive Officer of Sanitation and Water for All, a UN-hosted partnership working toward universal water, sanitation, and hygiene. Catarina, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.